Wednesday morning, November. One day after they put her father in the ground, Jason Henderson pulled out a chair, sat across from his 8 months pregnant wife, and slid a sealed envelope across the kitchen table. His face was composed, rehearsed, the face of a man who had decided something and was simply informing her of it. "I want a divorce," he said. "I've already spoken to a lawyer." Claire's hands went still around her coffee cup. She raised her eyes to his red, hollow, swollen from 3 days without sleep, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then, quietly, "My father was buried yesterday, Jason." He glanced at his watch. That single gesture, that one glance at the time. In that moment, Claire Henderson understood two things with complete clarity. The first, her marriage had been over for a very long time. The second, the man sitting across from her had just made a catastrophic miscalculation, because the quiet janitor they had lowered into the ground the day before had spent 34 years building a secret worth $3.4 billion, and he had left every single dollar of it to the woman Jason was discarding like an inconvenience. Jason Henderson thought he had calculated everything correctly. He had never been more wrong in his life. Stay with me, because this story is about to teach you something powerful about patience, power, and the people who are most dangerous to underestimate. Make sure you watch until the end. The room holds 200 people. Chandeliers hang overhead like frozen waterfalls. White linen covers every table. The quiet clink of crystal fills the air between conversations. It is the kind of event that takes years to build toward. The kind that makes you understand, looking at it, that something significant is about to happen. And it is about to happen in approximately 4 minutes. A woman is going to walk to that microphone and say something that will change every single person in this room. Not loudly, not dramatically. She will simply speak the truth, calmly and clearly, the way her father taught her to speak every important thing. The man in the third row does not know this yet. His name is Jason. He is doing the kind of frantic mental arithmetic that happens when reality no longer matches your calculations. His hands are gripping the edge of the table. His knuckles are going white. But we cannot start here. We need to go back. This story does not begin in a room full of chandeliers and white linen. It begins in a hospital room, on a Tuesday evening in November, with a man on a ventilator and a woman who has not slept in 41 hours. Claire Henderson was 34 years old when her world began to come apart. She was 8 months pregnant, a former elementary school reading specialist, and the daughter of the most reliable person she had ever known. She had been sitting beside her father's hospital bed in room 4C of St. Andrew's Medical Center since Monday morning, and she had watched the clock on the wall complete 2 full rotations and most of a third. She knew the exact number of ceiling tiles in the hallway outside his room, 43. She knew this because paying attention to small concrete things is sometimes the only way to survive the unsurvivable. Robert Henderson was 67 years old. To the people of Millbrook, Virginia, he was the custodian at Millbrook Elementary School. He arrived before the teachers every morning and stayed after the last child left every afternoon, 3 evenings a week. He handled maintenance at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church on the south side of town. On weekends, he repaired fence posts and replaced broken gutters and fixed leaking pipes for neighbors who paid him in warm meals and genuine gratitude. And he accepted both with the same quiet dignity he brought to every single thing he did. He had raised Claire entirely on his own. Her mother Eleanor had died during childbirth 34 years earlier, and Robert had turned his complete and undivided attention toward the small, dark-haired, serious girl who looked up at him from her hospital bassinet with eyes that already seemed to be paying careful attention to the world. He taught her practical things: how to change a flat tire at age 12, how to read a legal contract at age 15, how to walk into a room and immediately distinguish between people who held genuine authority and people who were only performing it. He told her once, washing dishes after supper with the kitchen radio playing low, that money makes a great deal of noise, but a person's true character is a quiet whisper, and that the wisest people spend their lives learning to hear that whisper rather than adding to the noise. He slept on the sofa in their 1-bedroom apartment for 16 years so that she could have the bedroom. He never framed this as a sacrifice. He never asked for acknowledgement of it. It was simply what love looked like in practice. And he believed, firmly and without sentiment, that practice was the only thing that counted. Now Claire held his hand beside the hospital bed. His fingers were warm, the calluses on his palms, built from decades of honest work, pressed against her skin like old familiar anchors. The ventilator hissed. The monitors beeped. Somewhere down the hallway a cart rattled past. One text message had arrived from her husband Jason at 11 that morning. "Thinking of you, babe. Let me know if you need anything." It was now 6:47 in the evening. Nothing since. She had put her phone face down on the chair beside her and had not looked at it again. She leaned close to her father's face. His skin smelled of antiseptic, and underneath that, cedar and Old Spice. The same combination that had meant home for her entire life. "I'm right here." "Dad," she whispered, "you don't have to worry about anything." And then his fingers moved. She sat up so fast the chair scraped the floor. "Dad," his eyes did not open, but his lips parted. She leaned in until she was inches from his face. He forced out 3 words. They came slowly, pulled from somewhere very deep. "3 accounts," he said. His voice was barely air. "Charles knows." The monitors erupted. The room filled with nurses and a physician within seconds. Claire was guided gently but firmly into the hallway, where she stood with her palms flat against the cool wall, waiting for a confirmation she already carried in her chest. Robert Henderson was gone within the hour. She stood in that hallway for 11 minutes. She counted ceiling tiles. 43. 3 accounts. Charles knows. She had no idea what it meant. She held the words carefully, the way you hold something fragile before you understand its shape. The funeral took place on Thursday morning. It rained the way November rains in Virginia when it decides to mean business sideways and relentless. The kind that turns cemetery grounds to soft, dark mud and soaks through wool coats in the first 10 minutes. Claire stood at the open grave in a black dress, 8 months pregnant, her feet already wet through her shoes. Jason stood 4 feet to her left, under his own umbrella. An umbrella he had not offered to share once in the 40 minutes they had been standing there. She noticed this, not because she needed romance. She noticed it because when a hard gust pushed against her from the left and she shifted her weight to keep her footing, he did not move, did not reach for her arm, did not step closer, did not look up from his phone. And in the half second before she caught herself, she saw the faintest edge of a smile cross his face at something on the screen. At her father's funeral, while she stood in November rain carrying their unborn daughter, member after member of Robert's community came forward to share memories. The second-grade teacher whose classroom Robert had quietly restocked with supplies from his own pocket 3 years running. The elderly widow whose furnace he had repaired one February morning without being asked and without leaving a bill. The deacon from St. Andrews who said, simply, that Robert Henderson had been the first person to arrive and the last person to leave at every single church event for 25 years, and that he had done this without once asking to be recognized for it. When the pastor invited family to speak, Claire walked forward on her own. Her voice was steady. She spoke about her father's hands always moving, always building, always reaching toward whatever needed doing. She spoke about Sunday evenings with the television playing and boot polish on the kitchen table. She spoke about the refrigerator calendar with every school event circled in red, and about the fact that he sat in the very back row of every single one of those events, trying not to take up space, but that his eyes never once left her. She made it halfway through before the words stopped coming. She stood at the lectern in the rain, breathing carefully, one hand resting on her belly. She finished as best she could, and she walked back. Jason offered nothing. No hand, no word, no gesture. When the moment came to lay the white rose, Claire moved to the edge of the grave. Her heel sank into the soft earth. She felt herself tilt, that sudden sickening shift when the ground fails you. A hand caught her arm, firm and immediate. Margaret Eloise Porter was 72 years old, a small woman with quick eyes and white hair who had attended St. Andrews for as long as anyone could remember. She had moved faster than anyone else in that circle. "I've got you, sweetheart," Margaret said. "I've got you right here." Jason was 4 feet away. He did not look up. There are moments that rewrite everything that came before them, not by what they contain, but by what they make visible. Standing at the edge of her father's grave, held steady by a near stranger while her husband scrolled his phone, Claire Henderson understood something she had been carefully not looking at for a very long time. The marriage had been ending. She had simply refused to face the direction it was traveling. After the service, the community gathered at the fellowship hall for the reception. There were casseroles nobody really wanted, and coffee going cold in paper cups, and the particular kind of conversation that happens when 50 people are trying to say something meaningful about a loss they genuinely feel. Women pressed Claire's hands. "He is with the Lord now. He is in a better place." She thanked each of them and meant the gratitude even when the words felt insufficient, because she understood they were offering the best of what they had. Jason found her in the corner after 20 minutes. "I've got the Morrison account review first thing tomorrow," he said. "I should really head out tonight." Claire looked at him. "My father was buried 3 hours ago. I know. I'm so sorry. But this review has been scheduled since go," she said. He kissed her forehead brief. Mechanical. The kind of gesture performed out of habit rather than feeling. Then he was gone. Diane Foster crossed the room without being asked. She had been Claire's closest friend since their first week of college, a pediatric nurse who understood, perhaps better than most, that presence was often more powerful than language. She sat down in the chair Jason had just vacated, took Claire's hand in both of hers, and said absolutely nothing. She stayed for an hour and a half, through the last of the other guests. Through the clearing of the casseroles, through the stacking of the folding chairs. Some people talk about what they will do for you. Other people are simply there when you need them. Claire had always known which kind Diane was. She had never needed the reminder more than she did that afternoon. The apartment was quiet in the particular way spaces go quiet after funerals. Like the walls are waiting for something that is not coming back. Claire had changed out of the black dress. She was sitting at the kitchen table in worn jeans and her father's old college sweatshirt, eating saltine crackers because she had realized somewhere around 9 that evening that she had not consumed a real meal in over 24 hours. The crackers were a compromise between knowing she should eat and the complete absence of appetite. Her phone buzzed on the table. Diane. Claire. Diane's voice was different from her usual voice. Careful in a way that meant she had already decided something before she called. I need you to open Instagram. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. Claire looked at the phone for a moment. Then she opened the app. The photograph had been posted 52 minutes earlier. It showed Jason and a woman Claire did not recognize sitting across from each other at Beaumont Steakhouse, which was a place Jason liked for client dinners, because the lighting made everyone look successful, and the wine list was long enough to impress people who cared about wine lists. The candles were lit. 2 glasses of red wine stood between them. The woman was leaning forward, her head thrown back in laughter at something Jason had just said. Jason was reclined in his chair with the ease of a man who had nowhere in the world he would rather be. He was smiling in a way Claire had not seen in months. The caption read, "Some nights just feel like the beginning of everything," posted with 2 champagne glass emojis and a small cluster of stars. Her father had been in the ground for less than 7 hours. Claire stared at the screen until the image blurred at the edges. The tears did not come right away. What came first was something colder and more specific, a reckoning. The kind that does not arrive with noise. The kind that settles over everything like cold water filling a room, degree by quiet degree, until you realize the temperature has changed completely and there is no going back to what it was before. She set the phone face down on the table, walked to the kitchen sink, turned on the cold tap and held her wrists under it for a long moment, feeling the water run. Then she looked at her reflection in the dark window above the sink, pregnant, exhausted, utterly alone, married to a man who had not waited a full day after her father's funeral before taking another woman to dinner and calling it the beginning of everything. She picked up her phone and called Diane. "I need you to drive me somewhere tomorrow morning." "Where?" Diane asked immediately. No hesitation, no sleep-fogged pause. "I don't know yet, but I will. I'll be there," Diane said. "Whatever time you need." Claire put the phone down, turned off the kitchen light, and went to sit in the dark living room. She sat there for 2 hours, not crying, not planning, just letting the reality of it settle into her fully so that when she did have to move, she would be moving from solid ground and not from shock. At 2:17 in the morning, she heard Jason's key in the front door. She had not moved from the chair. She sat in the dark with her hands in her lap and waited. He turned on the hallway light, came into the living room, stopped when he saw her. "Sit down, Jason," she said. "Claire, it's late. I didn't think you'd be sit down." He sat in the chair across from hers. He was freshly groomed, slightly more relaxed than he should have been. A man who had spent his evening pleasantly and had not yet found his way back to the appropriate expression for the circumstances. The room was quiet for a long moment. "How long?" Claire asked. He knew exactly what she was asking. He had the grace, at least, not to pretend otherwise. Another silence stretched between them. 8 months, he said. 8 months. The baby had been growing inside her for 8 months. The same 8 months. The parallel was not lost on either of them, though only one of them seemed to understand the full weight of it. Claire sat with this for a moment without speaking, without moving, without letting her face change. "Were you going to tell me before or after I delivered?" "I was going to wait until you were in a more stable." "Don't," she said. She stood up from the chair. She was 8 months pregnant, and she had not slept properly in 3 days, and she had buried her father that morning, and she had just learned that her husband had been conducting an affair for the entire duration of her pregnancy. And her voice was perfectly level when she said the next words. "I want you out of this apartment by Friday." He had prepared for a different kind of conversation. She could see it in the way his expression shifted, cycling rapidly through the responses he had rehearsed and finding none of them applicable. He had prepared for tears, for accusations, for a negotiation. He had not prepared for a woman who simply ended the conversation. "Claire, I think we need to Friday," she said again. She walked to the bedroom. She closed the door quietly behind her. She lay down on top of the covers in her father's sweatshirt and stared at the ceiling and breathed carefully until her heartbeat slowed to something manageable. Here is something that matters, and it is worth stopping the story for a moment to say it plainly. What Claire did in that apartment, in the dark, alone, after the worst day of her adult life, that was not suppression. She was not holding herself together for performance or for pride. She was doing something much harder and much more specific. She was allowing herself to understand the full truth of her situation before she reacted to any part of it. She was giving herself the gift of clarity before she gave herself permission to feel. If you are in a moment like this right now, a moment where everything you believed was holding you has given way at once, you do not need to be brave for anyone watching. You do not need to have a plan by morning. You need to find the clearest possible picture of where you actually are, and then you need to call one person and say, "I need you tomorrow." That is the whole first step. Everything else comes after. Jason slept in the guest room. Claire heard him move through the hallway without stopping at her door. She did not sleep. But by the time the gray November morning came through the curtains, she knew exactly what she needed to do. The lawyer arrived on Thursday morning. Claire was in the kitchen making tea when the knock came at the door. Jason had been gone since Tuesday evening, most of his immediate belongings collected in a single overnight bag. The apartment felt both emptier and cleaner for his absence, which told Claire something she had probably known for a while. The man at the door was polite, professionally dressed, carrying a brown leather briefcase. He introduced himself as an associate from the firm representing her husband, and he expressed his condolences about her father before handing her a thick manila envelope. Inside, a complete divorce filing, signed by Jason, date stamped Tuesday morning, the morning after the funeral. Diane was sitting at the kitchen table, reading through the documents within 10 minutes. Her pediatric nurse's training had given her a particular ability to absorb difficult information without flinching, and Claire watched her face carefully as she turned the pages. "Claire." Diane set a specific page on the table and placed her finger at the top of a paragraph. "His lawyer is claiming a right to review any inheritance received during the marriage. He doesn't know what my father had. He knows something, or he suspects something. Someone must have mentioned that Robert had accounts somewhere." This was the part that clarified Jason Henderson for Claire more completely than anything else that had happened. He did not know about any trust. He did not know about any fortune. He was fishing. He had calculated that a man who worked as a custodian for 35 years might have managed to accumulate perhaps $150,000 in savings. Maybe $200,000. He was trying to claim half of even that. The smallness of it, the pettiness of the arithmetic. The way he had looked at her father's entire life and arrived at a number that barely covered a year of his own golf membership. "I need to call Patricia Grove," Claire said. Diane already had the name pulled up on her phone. "She has an opening today at 3. That same morning, Diane drove Claire to Riverside Drive, to a building with no sign on the door and a buzzer entry and marble floors inside that whispered of old, quiet money. The brass plate beside the door read, "Whitmore Private Wealth Management." Claire had found the name Charles by searching every male Charles within a 40-mile radius who worked in financial services. She had narrowed it to 3. Whitmore was the first name on the list. She had called that morning from the car and given her name to the woman who answered, and the woman had said, simply, "Of course, Miss Henderson, please come in." They had been expecting her. She had not mentioned her father, had not explained why she was calling, and they had been expecting her. Charles Whitmore met Claire in the lobby before she reached the reception desk. He was 67 years old, with the kind of calm that comes from having witnessed a great many things and having learned to take none of them lightly. He was built like a former naval officer, which, as it turned out, was exactly what he was. He looked at Claire with eyes that held 34 years of kept promises in them. "You have your father's eyes," he said, "and you look like you haven't slept." He said you'd say something like that. He was usually right about things. Charles gestured toward a hallway beyond the reception desk. "Please, come with me. There is a great deal I need to tell you." He led them to a private conference room with a long table and no windows, and a pitcher of water that had been placed there before they arrived. He set a thick folder on the table and sat down across from them. He folded his hands. He looked at Claire for a moment in the way of someone deciding where to begin a story that begins a long way back. "Your father and I were roommates at the University of Virginia," Charles began. 1978. We were both 19 years old, and we had almost nothing in common except that we were both in our different ways. Entirely serious people. We became the closest of friends. He opened the folder. What I am about to tell you is the truth about your father's life. All of it. He wanted you to hear it from me because he felt he could not explain it to you himself without the emotion getting in the way of the clarity. Robert Henderson's given name was not Robert Henderson. He was born Robert Caldwell III, the only son of William Caldwell II, heir to the Caldwell Family Private Trust, 4 generations in private timber, real estate, and infrastructure contracts dating to the 1880s. By the time Robert turned 28 years old, the Caldwell family estate was valued at over $800 million. He was the presumptive heir to every dollar of it. He met Eleanor at a used bookstore near the university campus during his 3rd year of graduate school. She was a school teacher from rural Virginia, the daughter of a tobacco farmer and a Sunday school teacher. She wore her hair in a braid when she worked and read poetry on her lunch breaks. She had a particular laugh that Robert later described to Charles as the sound of someone who found the world genuinely surprising and delightful, which was a quality he had not previously understood he was missing. He wanted to marry her. His family's response was not a single dramatic confrontation. It was something quieter and more comprehensive than that. They spread precise, targeted rumors about Eleanor's motivations. They pressured his landlord. They called in professional favors to close career doors. They communicated, through channels that could never be directly attributed to any individual, that Robert's future within the family structure would look entirely different if he proceeded with this particular choice. They presented it as concern. It was control. They gave him a choice, Charles said. The family and everything that came with it, or Eleanor and the life he actually wanted. He chose Eleanor, Claire said. He chose Eleanor, immediately and without hesitation, which I think surprised them. They had expected negotiation. He simply chose. Before Robert left, the family's longtime attorney, an elderly man who had served the Caldwells for 40 years and had spent most of that time quietly disapproving of the way they conducted themselves, informed Robert of something the family had overlooked in their certainty that they held all the cards. The original Caldwell Trust, established by Robert's grandfather in 1922, contained a provision for direct line heirs that predated the modern family governance structure and could not be revoked by the current patriarch. Robert possessed a beneficial interest in the underlying assets of that trust, not accessible cash, a legal ownership stake that could not be stripped from him regardless of what his father chose to do. Robert did not touch it. He changed his name, moved 3 states away, found work that did not require connections or references, and started over with Eleanor and nothing else. He appointed Charles as trustee, and then he disappeared from the Caldwell family's world completely. He did not build this from a custodian's salary, Charles said carefully, watching Claire's face. I want to be clear about that. This is not a story about a man who secretly accumulated billions while mopping floors. This is a story about a man who already held a legal stake in a substantial fortune, who walked away from access to it, changed his name, and spent 34 years making sure his daughter learned what things were worth before she learned what she had. He placed a single sheet of paper on the table in front of her. Claire looked at the number at the bottom. She read it once. She read it a second time. She set the paper down. That is the current trust valuation, Charles said. Conservative estimate. Your father avoided high-risk ventures. He always chose stability over growth. The number was $3.4 billion. The room was very quiet. That's not possible, Claire said. The assets are held across 12 separate legal entities in 7 states. The trust predates your marriage by 22 years, which is the relevant legal fact right now. Under the laws of this state and the 3 states where primary assets are held, inherited assets structured this way constitute separate property. Your husband's attorney can file whatever discovery request he likes. There is nothing in this trust that is reachable by your marriage. The spousal exclusion clause, Claire said slowly. Your father included it specifically. He had watched too many families with significant wealth destroyed by divorce proceedings. He built a legal wall around your inheritance 34 years ago. No spouse, regardless of the circumstances of the marriage, has any claim to any portion of these assets. Not the principal, not the income generated, not a single dollar. Claire sat with this for a long time. $3.4 billion. Her father, who had polished his work boots every Sunday evening, who had slept on a sofa for 16 years, who had sent her to school with lunches packed in old grocery bags and attended every school event by sitting in the last row so as not to take up space. He had known exactly who he was the entire time. He had simply chosen not to let that particular knowledge define the life he was building for her. Does Jason's lawyer know any of this? She asked. No, and your father made certain they never would. His name does not appear on a single public document connected to this trust. Not once in 34 years. Claire picked up her phone and dialed Patricia Grove. "I need to talk to you about something," she said when Patricia answered. "Something significant." She left the Whitmore building at 2:30 in the afternoon with Diane beside her. And for the first time since Tuesday, she felt something that resembled solid ground beneath her feet. The terrible things were still there, the grief, the betrayal, the divorce papers waiting for Patricia to review. But they had edges now. They were containable. She understood the shape of them. And underneath everything, there was this, $3.4 billion in an irrevocable trust with her name on it, that Jason Henderson could not touch even with both hands and the best lawyers his salary could afford. "I think we're going to be okay," she told Diane as they walked to the car. Diane exhaled with the particular depth of someone releasing something they had been holding for days. "Oh, thank God. Come on, I'll make dinner." Real dinner, not saltines and grief. Claire unlocked the car, settled into the passenger seat, reached for the seatbelt. Her phone rang. Unknown number. St. Andrew's Medical Center main line, Mrs. Henderson. "This is Dr. Patricia Lawson. I'm the on-call obstetrics physician at St. Andrew's. Your blood pressure, reading from Tuesday's appointment, triggered a follow-up alert in our system. The numbers are concerning enough that we need you to come in immediately for evaluation. Preeclampsia, dangerously elevated blood pressure at 34 weeks. The baby's heart rate was to be monitored. Early delivery was a possibility. Complete bed rest was mandatory starting immediately. Claire was in a hospital bed for the second time in 5 days. Monitors attached. The same particular antiseptic smell in the air. The same overhead lights making their low hum. This time the room was a maternity ward room, with a window that looked out onto the parking structure. And this time, there was no one in the chair beside her when she arrived. Diane had been behind her in her own car and was parking somewhere below. The nurse who took her initial readings was efficient and professional and clearly very busy, but she paused before leaving the room. She looked at Claire's face in the particular way of someone who has spent 12 years watching women in moments of crisis and has learned to read what the face is doing underneath the expression it is performing for the room. "Is there someone I can call for you?" the nurse asked. Her name badge read Helen Marsh. "My husband and I are." Claire started. "He won't be coming." "That's okay," Helen said. "I'm not going anywhere for a few minutes." She pulled up the visitor's chair and sat down. She did not ask questions. She did not fill the silence with professional reassurances. She simply sat there, this stranger in green scrubs at the end of what was clearly a demanding shift. And she was present. 20 minutes later, Diane arrived, slightly out of breath, and took the chair. Helen Marsh gave Claire's hand a brief, firm squeeze before she left to attend to her other patients. Claire would remember her for years, not because of the gesture, which was small, but because of the moment it occupied the specific gap between where Jason should have been and where no one was, and because Helen Marsh had seen that gap and stepped into it without being asked. Pay attention to people who do that. They are showing you what love actually looks like in practice. Not the announced version, the shown-up version. 35 minutes after Claire was admitted, Jason Henderson walked into the lobby of the maternity ward. He did not know about the preeclampsia. His attorney had identified the hospital admission as a strategic window, a moment when Claire might be emotionally vulnerable enough to sign without extensive review. He was carrying a manila envelope, and he had the look of a man executing a task he had decided to treat as administrative. Diane saw him from across the waiting room before he saw her. She stood up. "Jason." He stopped. "Diane, is she here? I just need 5 minutes with her."
Your wife,
Diane said, and her voice was the carefully controlled voice of a pediatric nurse who has learned to deliver difficult information without raising it, "is upstairs with dangerously elevated blood pressure and your baby on a fetal monitor. And you have papers under your arm." A pause. The attorney said this was a reasonable time to—
"I don't care what the attorney said."
"Diane, this process is going to happen regardless of— "Get out of this hospital right now," Diane said. "Or I walk to that nurse's station and tell them that the man in the lobby is attempting to serve legal documents to a patient in active obstetric distress. I will do that. Do not test me." Jason looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the envelope on the end table beside Diane's chair. "Just give her those when she's ready," he said. He left. Diane picked up the envelope. She held it in both hands for a moment, looking at it. Then she put it in the outer pocket of her bag and did not mention it to Claire for 3 days. He had come to a hospital where his pregnant wife was in a medical emergency. He had come with paperwork. This is not a story about a villain. Jason Henderson was not a cartoon. He was a real person who had made a series of calculations and had never once questioned whether the thing he was measuring was the right thing to measure. A person reaches for what matters most to them when they are under pressure. What Jason reached for, consistently, in every critical moment, was his timeline. That tells you everything you need to know about who he had become. There is a question that sits at the center of this kind of story, and it is worth asking plainly. Have you ever stayed somewhere past the point where you knew, quietly and certainly, that you should leave? Not because you were weak, not because you were naive, but because leaving requires you to acknowledge what staying has cost you, and some truths are easier to carry unexamined. Most of us have been there. Most of us have understood something uncomfortable about a relationship or a situation and have chosen, for a while, to keep that understanding in a room we do not visit very often. Claire had done this. She was not ashamed of it. The human capacity for hope is not a flaw, but there comes a point when hope has to be exchanged for accuracy. And that point had arrived for Claire Henderson somewhere between the umbrella at the funeral and the photograph at the steakhouse. She spent 2 weeks on bed rest, and during those 2 weeks, she did something that surprised people who had been watching her with concerned eyes. She got strategic. The divorce papers arrived through Patricia's office, properly formatted, legally complete. Claire read every single page. She called Patricia the following morning. "I want to make a change to the settlement." "What change?" Patricia asked. "No spousal support. Nothing for me. For child support. I want the legal minimum only." A pause that communicated a great deal without words. "Claire, you are leaving significant money on the table." "I know exactly what I'm leaving on the table." "May I ask why?" "Because I will not spend the next 18 years of my daughter's life having Jason Henderson tell her that he provided for us. I will not give him that story. He does not get that story." Patricia was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had something in it that was not quite professional admiration, but was close to it. "All right, I'll draw it up." People often think of negotiation as the art of acquiring everything you can reach. It is sometimes the opposite. Sometimes the most precisely strategic thing you can do is identify what you refuse to take, what you refuse to allow the other person to hold over you, and close that door permanently. Claire was not being selfless. She was being exact. She was removing a lever from Jason's hands before he could figure out how to use it. Diane was staying with her through the bedrest weeks, sleeping on the pull-out sofa in the second bedroom, bringing meals and medications, and on the afternoons when Claire hit the particular wall of exhaustion that comes from having survived too many consecutive hard days, sitting quietly in the bedroom chair and reading so that Claire could sleep knowing someone was nearby. "You know what I keep thinking about," Claire said one evening. "Tell me," Diane said. "That he never asked. Jason never once asked me about my father's history. We were married for 5 years. He met my father probably 30 times. He never asked a single question about who my father was before he became the man at Millbrook Elementary. He just accepted the surface of him and moved on." Diane set her book down because he thought he already had all the information he needed. He thought he could see the whole picture from where he was standing, and he was looking at the wrong things. He was measuring the wrong things, Claire said. The whole time, she lay back against the pillow. The baby moved inside her, a slow rolling turn that had become familiar over the past weeks. The particular rhythm of her daughter settling herself. "Charles is coming next week," Claire said. "He says Dad left something else. A second envelope. Did he say what's in it?" "No. He said Dad specified I should have it when I was ready." She was quiet for a moment. "I think I'm ready." Charles Whitmore arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with a sealed envelope and the expression of a man who has been waiting patiently for the right moment and believes it has arrived. He set the envelope on the kitchen table in front of Claire. It was cream-colored, slightly yellowed at the edges, sealed with a wax impression she did not recognize as anything she had seen before. Her father's handwriting on the front. In the careful leftward slant she knew from every birthday card of her childhood. "When you are ready, you will know when." Inside was a 14-page document from a private investigative firm in Richmond, dated 26 months before her father's death. Robert Henderson had commissioned a detailed investigation into Jason Henderson beginning 30 months into Claire's marriage. The report documented the development of Jason's relationship with Whitney Carmichael in precise chronological order. The initial inappropriate messages that had begun during a work retreat in Scottsdale. The escalation over the following 6 months. The pattern of concealment. Her father had known for over 2 years. He had said nothing to Claire. He had watched the whole thing unfold and had not intervened. "Why?" she asked Charles, who was sitting across the table, hands folded, watching her read. "He believed you had the right to discover this yourself, in your own time, when you were ready to receive it, not filtered through his eyes, not handed to you like evidence in a case he'd already decided. He felt very strongly that a person needs to arrive at the truth of their own life through their own perception. He was protecting me from his anger, Claire said slowly. Not from the truth. From his anger about the truth. Yes, Charles said. Exactly that. She turned to page 11. She read the paragraph there twice. Then she set the document down on the table and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. And then something happened that neither she nor Charles had expected. She started laughing, not bitterly, not with the hysterical edge of someone coming apart at the seams. She laughed with what was almost genuine amusement, the kind that surprises you by arriving. Diane looked up from the counter where she was making coffee. What? What is it? His firm, Claire said. Jason's real estate investment firm. They have been pursuing a major infrastructure contract with Caldwell Holdings for the past 2 years. She looked up at Diane. They've been cold calling and submitting proposals and trying to get in the door. They didn't know the connection. They just knew it was a lucrative target. Diane stared at her. Caldwell Holdings, as in the company that my father's family trust is built on. Yes, Claire shook her head slowly. He spent 2 years chasing a contract with the very family whose heir he was abandoning. He was married to the only person in the world who could have gotten him through that door. And he never thought to ask. He never thought to learn enough about me to ask. Charles allowed himself a small, quiet smile. There is a kind of irony that is not comedy but clarity. Jason had measured Claire's value by every metric available to him and had arrived at the wrong answer every single time, not because he was unintelligent, but because he had never thought to ask the right questions. He had looked at the surface of her and decided he understood the whole picture. He had looked at her father and seen a janitor. He had never wondered, not once, what was underneath. The baby shower took place on a Saturday afternoon in late September, 3 weeks before Claire's due date. 12 women came. Margaret Eloise Porter from St. Andrews, who brought a hand-stitched quilt in yellow and white. The woman from the house across the street who had shoveled Robert's walk every winter for 15 years without being asked. 3 teachers from Millbrook Elementary who had known Robert for over 2 decades and who cried, each of them, when they arrived and saw that the person hosting the party was Robert's daughter. It was, in the quiet way of genuinely good afternoons, one of the happiest hours Claire had spent in a year. There was lemonade and almond cake, and the kind of easy conversation that happens between people who feel, despite not having spent a great deal of time together, like they belonged to the same community. For about 6 weeks following that afternoon, Claire allowed herself to believe that the worst of it was behind her. The divorce was final. The baby was healthy and strong and nearly ready. The trust was safe. She had a new house, 3 bedrooms, a backyard with an oak tree, morning light in the kitchen. She had Diane. She had Charles. She had a community of people who had genuinely loved her father. She was almost right. 4 days after Lily Rose Henderson was born, a letter arrived from Jason's attorney. He was petitioning for primary custody, not joint. Primary, the argument. Claire Henderson was a single mother with no demonstrable employment income, recently hospitalized during her pregnancy for a medically serious condition, in the midst of significant personal and financial upheaval, and without a stable long-term financial plan demonstrably in place. He still thought she had nothing. Lily Rose Henderson arrived on a Thursday morning in early October. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, dark hair from the moment of birth, which surprised no one who had seen Claire's own baby photographs. Her grandfather's particular set to the jaw. Her grandmother Eleanor's mouth, the shape of it, the same as in the one photograph Robert had kept in a small frame on his nightstand for 34 years. Claire held her daughter in the delivery room for a long time before she spoke. The room was quiet in the way. Rooms are sometimes quiet when something irreversible has just happened. Charles Whitmore sat in the chair in the corner, having insisted on being present and having waited in the hallway for 11 hours without complaint. Helen Marsh, now 3 months past that first encounter, had requested to be the attending nurse when she saw Claire's name on the board. She was. Lily looked up at Claire with the slightly unfocused gaze of the newly arrived, and Claire felt something that she later described to Diane as the sensation of the whole world reorganizing itself around a new and permanent center. "Hello," she said softly. "I've been waiting for you." She called no one else. She did not post photographs. She sat with her daughter and let the first hours be what they were: private, specific and entirely hers. Jason sent flowers 4 days later. A generic arrangement from a hospital flower service. Carnations and baby's breath, with a card that read, "Congratulations. Wishing you both well." She put the flowers in the hallway garbage without particular anger. The gesture was neither cruel nor kind. It was nothing. Which was, she had come to understand, very much who Jason Henderson had always been in the moments that mattered. The custody petition arrived the same morning. Claire sat at the kitchen table in the early morning light with Lily asleep in the bassinet 3 feet away, and she read the document that Jason's attorney had prepared with. She noted, considerable care and considerable confidence. He still thought she had nothing. He had calculated that a woman in her position recently divorced, recently widowed in the parental sense, medically compromised during pregnancy, apparently without stable income, was a beatable opponent in a family court proceeding. He had done the arithmetic again. He had arrived at the wrong answer again. But here is the thing about this particular moment that matters beyond the arithmetic. Reading that document at the kitchen table, Claire Henderson hit the wall. Not because she did not know how to respond, not because she lacked the resources. She hit the wall that everyone who has rebuilt their life from the ground up eventually hits the specific late night, early morning wall that arrives when you have been strong for so long, in so many consecutive situations, that the accumulated weight of all of it lands on you at once without warning. She put the document on the table. She walked to the second bedroom, where her father's rocking chair stood beside the bassinet, the one he had built from oak and walnut wood 20 years earlier, which she had found wrapped in moving blankets in his storage unit after he died. She sat down in it, brought her knees to her chest as best she could so recently after delivery, and she spoke out loud to the empty room. I don't know if I can do this, Dad. The house was quiet. October morning light was just beginning at the window. Lily made a small sound from the other room, not distress, just the particular murmur of a sleeping baby finding a new position. I know I'm going to do it anyway, Claire said. I just don't know if I can. There is a moment that everyone who has rebuilt their life from its foundations will recognize. It arrives in the early hours, when the house is quiet and you are holding or sitting near the thing you love most, and you wonder privately whether you are enough for what is being asked of you. You say, I do not know if I can do this, and then, because you have no other option and because the love is stronger than the doubt, you do it anyway. That moment is not weakness. That is the definition of courage that no one puts on a poster, because it is not photogenic. It is doing the next necessary thing in the dark, without certainty, with love as the only map. Claire sat in her father's rocking chair for 20 minutes. Then she got up, fed her daughter, and called Patricia Grove. He's petitioning for primary custody, she said. I know, I received the filing this morning. Can he win it? Courts prioritize demonstrable stability, financial stability in particular. If he can establish a clear advantage there, what if I can demonstrate that I am financially stable? Patricia was quiet for a moment. That would change the calculus entirely. Then it's time, Claire said. Call Charles. Tell him we're ready. Patricia Grove filed the financial disclosure through Charles Whitmore's firm on a Monday morning. The filing went to family court as required, and a summary was simultaneously transmitted, through proper legal channels, to the office of Jason's attorney. Jason's attorney called Patricia at 8:04 the following morning. We'd like to discuss withdrawing the petition for primary custody, he said. I thought you might. Patricia replied, We were not. We were not fully aware of the scope of the relevant financial picture. No, Patricia said. You weren't. The petition was formally withdrawn within 72 hours. A standard joint custody arrangement was filed in its place. Equal legal custody. Generous visitation rights for both parents. No material modifications without court approval. Clean and straightforward. Jason never saw the actual number in the disclosure. His attorney had seen it and had made the call. The conversation between them, whatever it contained, was not one Jason would have found easy. He had constructed his petition on the assumption that he was the financially superior party. He had made this assumption because it had never occurred to him to question it. Power does not always arrive with a trumpet. Sometimes it arrives as a phone call at 8 in the morning that ends in 3 minutes. Sometimes the most decisive victory in a person's life sounds, from the outside, like nothing at all. For several weeks after the custody matter was resolved, Claire allowed herself to believe that the hardest parts were behind her. She had navigated, in a single year, the death of her father, the betrayal and departure of her husband, a serious medical complication during pregnancy, a divorce, a custody battle, and the birth of her daughter alone. And without letting any of it break her in the permanent way that some things break people. She had done this by being, in the exact sense her father had always intended, her father's daughter. But Robert Henderson had one more thing to say. The envelope arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late September, 2 months after the custody matter closed. It was cream-colored letterpress stationery, the kind that communicates old money to anyone who has learned to read the language. Her name was written on the front in careful calligraphy. There was no return address. Inside, you are cordially invited to the inaugural gala of the Henderson Caldwell Foundation for Educational Access and Family Stability, October 14th. Black tie, 200 guests. Your presence is requested as the foundation's founding benefactor and primary honoree. She called Charles immediately. What is this? Your father's final project, Charles said. He spent approximately 2 years in its planning. I have been executing his instructions since March, when the timeline he left required me to begin. Why didn't you tell me before now? He specified that you should receive the invitation when you had had sufficient time to stand on solid ground. Those were his exact words. Sufficient time to stand on solid ground. Claire looked at the date. Jason is going to be there. A brief pause. Yes, why? Dad didn't even know about the divorce when he... Your father was a very good judge of character, Charles said. He did not need to know the specifics of a situation to understand its general shape. He left a guest list with explicit instructions. Jason was on it by name. Claire was quiet for a moment. Who else is on it? 3 representatives from Caldwell Holdings. A pause. They don't yet know the connection between the Henderson-Caldwell Foundation and the Caldwell name. They were invited under the foundation's general outreach to major regional families. He reclaimed the name, Claire said slowly, through an act of charity rather than through litigation. He chose to use the name better than they ever had. On the evening before the gala, Diane sat behind Claire in the bedroom mirror, working through her hair with careful hands. And they talked the way old friends talk when something important is about to happen. What if I fall apart up there? Claire asked. You've fallen apart before. You always get back up. This is different. 200 people. Diane set down the brush and looked at Claire's reflection directly. You have been walking into rooms you weren't prepared for your entire life, Claire. So has every single person who is going to be in that hall tomorrow night. The difference is that you know more than they do. You have always known more than people thought you did. Claire turned to look at her own reflection. She was wearing a deep navy gown, simply cut. The kind of expensive that announces nothing and conveys everything to the people who understand what they are looking at. She put on 2 pieces of jewelry, her mother Eleanor's wedding ring, which she wore on her right hand, and around her neck on a thin gold chain, a signet ring she had found in the safety deposit box at Whitmore's office, her grandfather's ring, the Caldwell family crest, the one side of herself she had never been permitted to know until now. He would want you to wear that, Diane said. I know, Claire said. She was not dressing for Jason Henderson. She was not dressing for the Caldwell family representatives who would be in the room tomorrow and who had no idea what was coming. She was dressing for a man who had worn the same 2 rotating work uniforms for 35 years and polished his boots every Sunday evening and slept on a sofa so that his daughter could have a bedroom, and who had done all of this while holding $3.4 billion in trust for the day she would need it. She was dressing for the person who had made her possible. Claire entered through the main doors. Charles had arranged for a private entrance at the side of the historic mansion, a former governor's estate, now an event venue, with chandeliers that fell like frozen waterfalls and floors so polished they reflected the ceiling above. He had been very careful about the private entrance, had explained its location twice. Claire did not use it. She stood for a moment in the foyer, straightened her shoulders in the way her father had taught her, not for performance, but for propriety, for the respect of being fully present in a room, and she walked through the main doors into the grand hall. The room did not fall silent all at once. It changed the way weather changes a shift in pressure, a ripple moving outward from wherever she entered. People who had known her father recognized her and felt the recognition of something significant arriving. People who had heard pieces of the story over the past months connected what they had heard to the woman walking toward them. People who knew Jason, and there were several, did a calculation they had not expected to need to perform that evening. She walked directly to Margaret Eloise Porter, who was standing near the front of the room with the posture of someone who had been hoping to be found. He would have been so proud of this room, Margaret said. Her eyes were full. He planned every detail, Claire said, even the centerpieces. Charles showed me his notes. Margaret laughed through her tears. That sounds exactly like him. Diane walked at Claire's shoulder. Quiet. There. Jason and Whitney were near the bar at the far end of the room. Jason saw Claire the moment she entered. She could tell by the way his body went still. The particular stillness of a person who has just received information that requires immediate reorganization of everything they thought they understood. Whitney did not understand yet why her husband had stopped moving. She looked at his face and began to. Claire did not look at either of them. Charles Whitmore took the podium at 8 o'clock precisely. He spoke about Robert Henderson as a man, not as a symbol and not as a cautionary tale, but as a specific human being who had spent 35 years in this community building something with his presence and his reliability and his willingness to show up. He talked about the Sunday maintenance at St. Andrews and the early mornings at Millbrook Elementary and the dozens of small repairs performed for dozens of neighbors over 3 decades. He let the room remember who this man had been to them. Then his tone shifted. "What most of you did not know," Charles said, "and what I am here tonight to share with you as both his lifelong friend and the executor of his instructions, is that Robert Henderson was born Robert Caldwell III. He was the presumptive heir to a family fortune with roots extending more than a century in this region. He walked away from that fortune at the age of 28 because the people who controlled it told him that the woman he loved was not part of the acceptable plan." A murmur moved through the room. The three Caldwell Holdings representatives were looking at each other with expressions Claire could read even from a distance. Jason had leaned forward in his chair. "He chose the woman," Charles continued, "and then he built a life based on his character rather than his inheritance. Tonight, we honor that choice, and we honor the daughter it produced." He turned to face the audience. "It is my great honor to introduce the Henderson Caldwell Foundation's founding benefactor and Robert's daughter, Claire." The applause began. Claire walked to the podium with steady, deliberate steps. She did not open with the trust. She did not open with the money. She opened with a Saturday morning in 1997 and a public library, and a little girl reading picture books on the floor while her father read a biography of Eisenhower at the table above her. "I asked him why he was reading about trust law," she said. "He was reading it alongside the biography, and I thought it seemed like an odd combination for a Saturday. He looked at me over the book and said, 'Because knowing how things work is the same as having a key.' I was 7 years old. I didn't understand what he meant." She paused. "I understand it now." She spoke about her father in the specific way he deserved to be spoken about, not in generalities but in details. The boots polished on Sunday evenings, the refrigerator calendar, the sofa that had been his bed for 16 years so that she could have a room of her own, the conversations over dishwater about what money really was and what character really was, and why the difference between the two was the most important thing she could ever learn. "My father did not raise me to be wealthy," she said. "He raised me to be useful." Most people with significant resources confuse those two things entirely. They mistake their net worth for their worth. "My father never made that mistake once in 34 years. She looked out at the 200 faces watching her. "The Henderson Caldwell Foundation exists because my father spent those same 34 years watching people fall through cracks that did not have to exist. Single mothers who lost employment because childcare was unaffordable. First-generation students who earned their place at a university and could not sustain the cost past the first year. Families separated from stable housing by a single medical bill. He watched this happen from close enough to touch it, because he chose a life that put him close enough to touch it. And he believed, absolutely, that proximity to a problem is the only honest foundation for solving it." She reached for the document Charles had placed on the podium beside her notes. "This foundation launches tonight with an initial endowment of $40 million, representing the first distribution from the Robert Henderson Caldwell Trust." Applause rose through the room. She held up one hand. The applause quieted. "That $40 million, she said clearly, represents approximately 1.2% of the trust's current total value." Complete silence. She let it hold for a moment. "The full valuation, as of last quarter, is $3.4 billion. The silence deepened into something different. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of reckoning. 200 people sat with the arithmetic of it, the impossibility of it, the fact of it. "I am not telling you this number to impress anyone in this room," Claire said. "I am telling you because my father spent his entire adult life being seen as considerably less than he was by people who confused his quiet with emptiness and his simplicity with limitation. He asked me, in the letter he left for me to find, to make certain the record reflected something specific." She looked out at the room. He was paying attention the whole time. Across the room, Jason Henderson sat with white knuckles on the edge of the table and did math that would not resolve. He had filed for divorce claiming the woman had nothing. He had petitioned for primary custody arguing he was the financially stable party. He had left a pregnant woman at her father's graveside because he had calculated that she was worth less than what he could gain by going. Every calculation. Wrong. He started to stand. No plan. Pure instinct. Some reflex toward doing something. Saying something. Diane Foster stepped in front of him before he had fully left the chair. She said one word. "Don't." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the calm, absolute certainty of someone who has been ready for this specific moment for a very long time. He sat back down. The applause that followed Claire's speech was thunderous. People rose to their feet without orchestration or encouragement. Some of them were crying, and some were simply standing because the moment required standing. And a few of the people who had known Robert best were doing both. Claire stepped away from the podium. She did not look at Jason. She returned to her seat and accepted the people who came to her: former neighbors, former colleagues of her father's, members of St. Andrew's who had known Robert for decades and were only now understanding the full picture of the man they had known. She was accepting the hand of a woman from the third row when she felt, rather than saw, a man approach and stop at a slight distance, waiting. She turned. He was in his mid-60s, silver at the temples, well-dressed in the old money way that announces nothing. He had the eyes of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had decided tonight to set it down. "Mrs. Henderson," he said. "My name is Thomas Caldwell. Robert was my first cousin." The room continued around them, but Claire felt the particular quiet of a sentence that changes the dimensions of a space. "I wasn't certain you'd be willing to speak with me," Thomas said. "Given everything, I would completely understand if you aren't." She looked at him for a long moment. "What do you want to say?" He took a slow breath. "I want to say that my family made a choice 34 years ago that we had no right to make. We decided that love was worth less than legacy. We decided that Eleanor wasn't an acceptable choice because she hadn't arrived with assets or connections or the right kind of name, and we made Robert pay for refusing to agree with us." He paused. "He was the finest person our family ever produced, and we spent 30 years pretending he didn't exist." Claire said nothing. "I don't expect anything from you," Thomas said. "I have no right to expect anything from you. I came because I thought you should hear, from someone who was there, that the people who tried to erase your father, at least one of us, has spent a very long time understanding what that cost us." He nodded once, quietly, and moved away. Claire stood there for a moment in the noise of the room. She had spent her whole life believing her father had walked away from a family. Standing in this room tonight, she understood the fuller truth. He had not walked away. He had been pushed out. And rather than spend his life looking backward at what they had taken from him, he had turned around completely and built something they could not have imagined: not a rival fortune, not a competing legacy, but a daughter who stood at a podium in a room full of 200 people and spoke about boots polished on Sunday evenings with the kind of love that could not be measured in any currency he had ever understood. She left the gala 30 minutes later, slipping out through the side entrance Charles had originally arranged for her arrival. There was no farewell speech, no dramatic exit. She simply gathered Diane with a look, and they walked out into the October night. Behind them, Jason Henderson sat at a table in a room full of chandeliers, doing arithmetic that would never add up correctly. Finally understanding that the error had not been in the numbers, it had been in what he had chosen to count. 6 months is not very long in the life of a foundation, but it is enough time to understand whether something has roots. In its first 6 months, the Henderson Caldwell Foundation provided full academic scholarships to 38 students from the first generation of their families to attend a 4-year university. It launched a workforce retraining center in partnership with 2 community colleges, offering certifications in fields with demonstrable employment demand. It established an emergency stabilization fund for single-parent families facing eviction or catastrophic medical costs, and within the first quarter, that fund had received over 300 applications. Claire managed none of this from a distance. She attended the scholarship selection committee meetings. She visited the workforce center on a Thursday morning in November and sat in on a computer skills class for 45 minutes. And afterwards, she shook hands with every person in the room. She read every application that came across her desk for the emergency fund herself, or as many as was humanly possible, because her father had believed that proximity to a problem was the only honest basis for addressing it. And she had inherited that belief along with everything else. She did all of this while being, concurrently, the mother of a daughter who was learning, with focused and total seriousness, that the world was full of things she could reach toward and grab. Lily, at 6 months old, had her grandfather's jaw and her grandmother Eleanor's mouth, and a very particular expression when something surprised her wide eyes. A small open circle of a mouth that made Claire laugh every single time. Jason saw Lily once, at Christmas time, for an afternoon that went well enough by the standard of such arrangements. He had remarried Whitney shortly after the divorce was final, and their life had continued in the direction he had chosen, and Claire had no particular thoughts about it beyond a general sense of the matter being resolved. He had sent a check to the foundation the previous fall, $5,000, a gesture that read as either conscience or calculation. Charles had returned it uncashed with a brief note, one word: declined. Whitney left Jason 14 months after the gala. The separation was practical and relatively quiet. She had understood, perhaps earlier than she admitted, that a man who leaves a pregnant wife the morning after her father's funeral to pursue a more convenient life is a man who will eventually locate a more convenient option than you as well. She was not wrong. Claire learned of this through a mutual acquaintance and felt nothing in particular about it. Jason had become what he had always been in danger of becoming, a footnote in a story that had never truly been about him. Not through any act of revenge on her part, simply through the ordinary passage of time and the weight of his own choices accumulating. On a Tuesday morning in April, Claire was pushing Lily's stroller through Riverside Park. The oaks were budding, the pale green of very early spring, and Lily was reaching toward everything she could see with an enthusiasm that treated the entire world as a collection of interesting things to grab and examine. Diane walked beside her. They were discussing, as they often did on these Tuesday morning walks, the Foundation's upcoming summer program, and whether Claire should accept the invitation she had received to speak at a regional nonprofit conference in June. Claire's phone rang. The name on the screen was one she did not recognize. She answered, "Mrs. Henderson." The woman's voice was unsteady in the particular way of someone who has rehearsed what they want to say and finds that the rehearsal has not fully prepared them for the actual moment. "My name is Donna Calloway. My son Ethan, he received a Henderson Caldwell Scholarship this year. He's starting at State in the fall." Claire walked and listened. "He's going to be the first one," Donna continued. "The first one in our family. In 4 generations. Nobody has done this. And he's going to do it because of you, Mrs. Calloway," Claire said. "Tell Ethan he earned it." But someone had to believe he was worth the investment. Someone looked at his application and saw what was there, Claire said. "That was easy. The harder thing was everything your son did to put that application in front of us. He did that part himself." There was a brief silence on the line. "Thank you," Donna said softly. "Thank you for believing that." After the call ended, Claire walked for a while without speaking. Diane did not fill the silence. She had learned, over the course of 30-plus years of friendship, when silence was a thing to fill and when it was a thing to respect. Lily spotted something on the path ahead, a leaf, fallen early, turning in a small circle in the light morning breeze. She pointed at it with absolute conviction and made the particular sound she made when she had identified something the world needed to know about. Claire stopped the stroller and picked up the leaf. She placed it in Lily's reaching hand. Lily held it up and looked at it with the expression that still made her mother laugh, the wide eyes. The small open circle of surprise. The total absorption of someone encountering for the first time the fact that a leaf is an extraordinary thing. Then she held it out toward Claire, offering it back. Diane was smiling. Claire took the leaf. She looked at it for a moment in her daughter's hand. There is something that happens, if you have been paying attention, in the last chapter of a story like this one. You begin to understand that the story was not about the money. It was never about the money. It was about a man who understood, at 28 years old, that the life he was being handed was not the life he wanted, and who gave up everything that would have made him comfortable in order to build something that would make his daughter free. It was about the choices that happen in private, when no one is watching, when there is no audience and no approval coming, and the only compass you have is your own sense of what matters. Robert Henderson had polished his boots every Sunday evening for 34 years. He had sat in the back row of every school event his daughter ever participated in, trying not to take up space. He had slept on a sofa so she could have a bedroom, and cooked dinner after a long day's work, and answered her questions about legal contracts and dishonest handshakes, and how to tell who in a room held genuine power and who was only performing it. He had done all of this while quietly, patiently, strategically protecting her future from the kind of people he had once been surrounded by. Not with anger, with love, which is in the end, the most powerful structural force available to any of us. And he had left her, when the time came, not just the money. He had left her the wisdom to know what it was for. That is the whole story, every piece of it. The rest is Lily Rose Henderson, holding a leaf in April sunlight like she has caught something extraordinary, which she has, because she is alive, and her grandfather made sure of that in every way available to him. And because her mother is standing on a path in Riverside Park on a Tuesday morning understanding, for maybe the first time completely, what the word inheritance actually means. It does not mean the assets. It never meant the assets. It means who you become from having been loved, carefully, by someone who paid attention. It means the quiet people who notice everything and say little and show up without being asked. It means the red circles on the calendar and the boots on the kitchen table and the sofa that was a bed for 16 years and the library on a rainy Saturday and the 3 final words from a man on a ventilator who had spent his entire life making certain his daughter would be prepared for whatever came after them. 3 accounts. Charles knows. She knew. She had always been going to know. He had made sure of it. If this story has stayed with you, and I hope that it has, I want to ask you something before you go. Think of someone in your life who has been underestimated, who has been looked at from a distance and measured incorrectly because the person doing the measuring never thought to ask the right questions. It might be someone you know. It might, if you are honest with yourself, be you. Your quietness is not emptiness. Your patience is not passivity. The life you are building in the private hours, when no one is watching and there is no applause and the only evidence of your effort is your own knowledge of it, that is the most important work you will ever do. Robert Henderson knew this. He knew it for 34 years. And on a Tuesday in November, at the end of his life, he looked at his daughter and gave her the only map she would ever truly need. He told her to go to the bank. She went, and the rest is who she became.